Hello guys, so today this is my first video focusing on tanking tips, and it is one of a number to come. Now this is ideally suited to those individuals who want to learn how to tank or want to perhaps improve on their A game. Though naturally I think that anyone can learn from this. As tanks we often make mistakes, and I'm certainly no perfect individual when it comes to my tanking. So, in terms of structuring the video, I wanted to first break it down into a controlled environment, so that you can view certain concepts, and then we're going to apply it to some boss fights that I've picked out. So one of the first things to consider when you're thinking about your positioning as a tank is to be reminded of the fact that DPS often employ ground dots in order to boost their damage even higher. Now what I was doing just then when I was sort of ringing around and rosing the boss was tracing out the area that the ground dot covers. Now obviously as tanks we don't want to have to use all of that, but I'm just demonstrating that there's a lot of flexibility there if you do need to move in essentially dire situations. However, the most optimal way to go about it is to side strafe, which you're seeing me do right here, and this allows us to actually cover a fair amount of ground without having the boss leave the dot, or in fact move a lot whatsoever. In some sense he's just pivoting. Now you may be wondering, well obviously that's all well and good for the rectangular dot, but what about the circular ones that I often see bow users use? So what I wanted to show here is actually both types of dots, circular and rectangular, overlap quite nicely, and that side strafing works perfectly well when both are active at the same time. So that means that you don't have to suddenly change up the way you're moving as a tank based on the dots that the DPS are applying. Now you might be thinking at this point, hey, but what about rearming trap? That's something that quite a lot of DPS use, and that's a lot smaller than these dots you've just showed. And look, fair enough. I get your point. That is certainly something that you have to be careful with because you don't want to move the boss out of it. And so what I want to show here is the actual sensitivity of this dot, and as you look very closely, it only really activates when it steps upon it. There's no real large radius, and it's important then to keep the boss in the same spot. And well, luckily, as you may have already guessed, side strafing has you perfectly covered there as well, because the boss is really not moving at all if done 100% correctly, or even, my level of correct, which is sometimes a little bit problematic at times. The boss is going to stay in a relatively similar spot, and as such the DPS doesn't have to worry about their trap not going off. So now that we have a better understanding of some of the common ground dots that DPS employ in their rotations, in conjunction with the side strafe technique in terms of positioning as a tank, I want to look at a couple of uncontrolled boss fights, where certain situations can change how you want to play. Now just then you saw a fear effect come off, and often with fear effects you'll get driven away from the centre where you're holding the boss and have to run back. Now sometimes what can happen is that the boss might actually follow you a little bit, and consequently, if you're not too quick, or if your ping doesn't allow you to stand break too easily, the boss will actually be dragged out of the dots. Now as you see me here, it's actually better then to just kind of run a little bit away from the boss to pull him back to centre. And depending on where you're positioning, you could imagine this is backpedaling to get the boss back to where he should be. At this point you may have noticed, well actually you're not side strafing too much in this particular example, and as you quickly see, I don't really do so here either. And well, one of the important things to remember about the side strafe technique I talked about is that I'm just demonstrating the amount of movement available to you if you need to use it. And this will become apparent later in the video when we look at another boss fight. So basically, if you don't need to move to avoid a conal or something like that, or a particularly damaging AoE, then there really is no need to side strafe. It is in some sense just extra work that you don't want to do, because who wants to cramp their hand pressing AD or whatever your movement keys may be constantly and repetitively. So I think it's a good idea, especially if you haven't got a good familiarity with a particular boss you're fighting, is to try and tell if he does have a conal attack within his repertoire. And if he does so, well, start to do your side strafing. Now you notice I do it occasionally from time to time in boss fights where it's not actually the case that they do have a conal, but this is just habit, and something it is a good idea to get a habit of, but definitely not required. Now what I want to point out with this fight was the fact that the boss will ambush the particular enemy. And it's important not to run after the boss when he goes to your DPS, who can often be quite far away from you. It's much better to let the boss run back to you and go back into the pre-existing ground dots. Thus your DPS doesn't have to constantly reapply their dots, which wastes precious time in the rotation, meaning lower DPS. This was pretty much in a similar example to the fear effect. Ultimately the point is that you want the boss to come to you, and you are always in the centre position, such that ground dots are never wasted. Now, another thing that's worth considering in terms of sort of standing in a similar position is that often you'll notice, bosses do effects such as this, which aren't really avoidable unless you move the boss out of the way. And this is a point where you have to consider within your tanking build, I need some kind of self-survivability to enable me to stand still in these semi-damaging environments. This enables us to keep the boss in the center position, where all the ground dots will have been applied. Now one of the concerns you might have with this technique is what about my melee DPS who might not be able to get in to actually damage the boss? Now first off, if this is the case and they absolutely cannot get into range, I would obviously recommend moving the boss because it's going to be more of a DPS loss if they can't use their main damaging abilities. However, I find that in most situations such as here, the DPS can still safely apply their damage without much concern, and that worrying about them too much can even sometimes be a bad idea. So I'd try not moving the boss, and if you feel complaints or if you see your DPS taking a lot of damage, take the appropriate action then, rather than running around and playing kissy with the boss for no reason. So what you saw briefly just then was me get hit by one of the boss's frontal, kind of conal attacks, and this is back to the usefulness of side strafing. So after getting hit by it, I've said to myself, okay mate, remember the side strafing technique, and I start to do it here, and once I expect another conal attack. And as you'll see, the boss does it here, and I successfully move out. One of the advantages of side strafing is that often you can have a quicker reaction time to conals, and consequently not get hit by them. So before I go into another benefit of the side strafe technique, I just want to bring attention back to the fact that you can actually 360 around the boss and pivot him without having to move him whatsoever. But why would you want to limit the arc of which we're side strafing to something resembling this, where we're facing the boss away from the group? Well, even though it doesn't have a conal in this particular example, this boss actually does fire particular mechanics at your DPS and healer. Now this is incredibly damaging and can, for the average HP individual, one-shot them pretty much reliably. And consequently this fight is probably, for those who have done it, a relatively obnoxious one, where sometimes you may feel frustrated because you have very little time to react, and often as a DPS you're just falling over and thinking, what the hell happened? Was it the tank's fault? Am I missing something? And so, how do we help them out? Well, by facing the boss away, it means that the boss itself actually has to pivot around and turn to face a particular DPS it's going to apply that one-shot mechanic to. And consequently you're adding maybe a second or so to the amount of time individuals have to react and dodge roll to avoid that mechanic. This means that just by simply, I say side strafing with, funny fingers, if you know what I mean. Just by doing that and facing the boss away, you can actually save your DPS's life in really a way I think a lot of people might not actually pick up on, as it's not that intuitive. Often I think you worry a bit more yourself rather than the boss itself in relation to your DPS. Now, as you may also have noticed, this boss is another good example of something else you'll commonly encounter, and that's that it drags you in and does a massive AoE effect. And obviously you want to move out of that, but as you see, because of the animation time, you can run away all the way out of it and move back in without the boss actually moving. So this is important to keep in mind. Just because we want to keep the boss in the center position doesn't mean we can't avoid certain mechanics like those AoE effects, because the boss itself actually will not move for a fair amount of time, enabling you to run out and in without any negative effects. So, I just wanted to briefly summarise what I've talked about in this video. First of all, we talked about ground dots and how they overlap and interact, and from looking at this, we found out that side strafing, just going back and forth and pivoting the boss in the same spot, was the best way for a tank to position. In conjunction, we also noted that it's important to face a boss away from the group so that they have more time to react to certain damaging effects. We also looked at certain situations, such as fear effects or teleports, where the boss would move away from the center position where all of the ground dots were applied and where you had been standing. Now, in the examples we talked about, we found that often it was better to just stay in the same position and let the boss come back to you, rather than forcing your DPS to reapply their ground dots at a new location. Now, some caveats did come with that, in that if the boss applied some kind of AoE effect around them and the DPS could not apply their main rotation, it was better to move the boss in that situation because you'd be missing too much DPS. That's all I have for this particular tanking tip video, and I hope you enjoyed the start of the series to come, which focuses on improving yourself as a tank. As always, I appreciate any support and criticism you may have, and with any luck I'll see you on another video. Bye for now.